Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're excited that so many of you could join us online and in person for our conversation on opening your deepest ground. I'm Pele Shalev, the events manager for CIIS Public Programs. We are here today at the California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco on the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yalamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yalamu identifies both the people and the territory. As a representative of CIIS, I want to express our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. It is so lovely to see those of you who are gathered here in the room, and to share space with all those who are joining us online and watching this conversation from all over the world. This acknowledgement that I made is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community. If you're joining us online, I invite you to call out in the chat where you're calling from. To learn more, we recommend the website native-land.ca as a starting resource. Now, before we start, I'd like to cover a few troubleshooting items. We will have a live Q&A after the conversation tonight. Since this is a hybrid event, we have a hybrid Q&A process so that our online and in-person guests all have the same chance to participate. Those of you who are here in the room will have found the QR codes linking to the Q&A form in each seat. Online, you'll find that a link in the event description below the video. We'll gather questions for our presenters from there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. For those of you who are online, chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated and our presenters cannot see the chat. So if you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find it negatively impacts your experience in any way. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, John Prendergast and Sara Max Granovetter, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Sara Max Granovetter, PhD and LMFT, is a core faculty member in CIIS's Graduate Department of East-West Psychology. She received her bachelor's degree in philosophy from Harvard University and her PhD from CIIS in 2021. A practicing mindfulness-based psychotherapist, Sara's clinical practice, pedagogy, and research weave together analytical psychology, Buddhist contemplative traditions, eco-psychology, and posthumanism. Her recent research involves reimagining Zen Buddhist teachings as posthuman praxis and a call to rewild psyche and society. A native of the San Francisco Bay Area, John Prendergast is a non-dual teacher, author, retired psychotherapist, and retired adjunct psychology professor at CIIS, where he taught and supervised master's level counseling students for 23 years. He studied for many years with the European sage Dr. Jean Klein, as well as with Adyashanti. He is the author of Your Deepest Ground, A Guide to Embodied Spirituality, The Deep Heart, Our Portal to Presence, and In Touch, How to Tune In to the Wisdom of Your Body and Trust Yourself. John has extensive experience teaching online and has offered residential retreats with his wife, Christiane, who's here in the room somewhere, since 2015 in both the US and more recently in Europe. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to John Prendergast and Sara Max Granovetter.
John, it's such an honor to be here with you and to get to talk about this really rich and fertile work that you've put forth in the world. Um, Now I've been sitting with the phrase, your deepest ground, and it strikes me as kind of both an invitation and a reminder, right? And I guess that for those of us in the CIIS community, I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about the way this inquiry builds a bridge between kind of inner inquiry and outer presence, as well as between integrating psychological material and being and sitting with a deeper mystery. And in particular, I'd love for you to say a little bit to start us off about what you mean by your deepest ground. It seems like that's a
That's a good start.
good start, right? And we can kind of go from there. And maybe, at risk of adding too many elements to the question, how was this book born from that place?
Mm, Lots of
Yeah,
questions.
lots of
So
questions. So
start
I'm
the
happy to come
conversation.
back if
Yeah.
it's too many.
Maybe definitions first, and then you can help prompt me with the other questions. Hmm. Well, when we think of the word ground, usually our attention drops down, doesn't it? And it kind of refers to some sense of stability and something about being in the body and connected to the earth, and connected to reality as well. So I use the word in two ways. One is a metaphor for a felt sense of being deeply connected with our bodies, and particularly the lower half of our body, which is, and so often in contemplative traditions, with some notable exceptions, undervalued or even devalued. So felt sense, subtle sense of our body, not just our physicality, which is important, because I used to think I was pretty grounded, but little did I know what the capacity of the body was. And what's interesting is as we become more intimate with our body and the felt sense of our body, our feelings, our sensations, subtle feelings, subtle sensations, we feel ourselves landing more and more deeply and more intimately into an interiority. But interestingly, and this has been fascinating, my work, both in terms of my own exploration, but my work with others, as we deepen into the body, it opens up. It's not as separative as we imagine. In fact, it takes us out of our separation from all elements of our experience, our separation from one another. As there's more intimacy here, there's more intimacy here, interpersonal, and more intimacy with what we call the world and the natural world. And the body is an earth body. And as we become more intimate with our earth bodies, we feel greater intimacy with the earth and with the planet and all living beings as well. So the felt sense reveals the body to be not just this kind of condensed object of anatomy and physiology. It has that quality, certainly. But as we begin to tend and listen more and more carefully, subtler dimensions, energetic dimensions of feeling and sensation unfold. And we discover it more as a field of vibration, more a sense of space internally. And so this is one of the kind of paradoxes, if you will, in terms of language, not in terms of experience, is as we really land more and more fully in our body and into our deep interiority, it opens up and is more spacious. And so now we're using words like ground and space simultaneously because they fit. Right. So that's the kind of metaphoric sense of the ground, and particularly the lower half of the body, because in my experience, my own experience in contemplative traditions, a lot of attention is given to mental clarity and differentiating attention from thought, and that's important. And there's a lot of mindfulness teachings, and not just formal mindfulness, but in different contemplative traditions accent that. And others also include the heart and the cultivation of compassion and kindness and gratitude, all of which are important. Not so many below the midline. And so a lot of people who are interested in spiritual life tend to be more mature here and more familiar with the open and spacious nature of the heart and the mind, much less so with the lower part of the body. And so for me, it's been a natural unfolding of exploration as these areas have kind of opened up here. And I've noticed that in my work with people as well, one-on-one work and group work. The more difficult journey really is the dropping of attention down and into the guts, into the belly, into the pelvic bowl, because this is an area of, it's more instinctual, it's more dense, there's a lot more resistance. And this is really the theme of the book now. It's like, I've been very interested in the process of letting go. Like, what is it that supports letting go? Because that seems to me the essence of really any spiritual approach, is the deep surrender and letting go. That can't be done willfully. So what supports that, letting go? And what obstructs it? What supports it? What obstructs it? And in that investigation, I have found doubt obstructs it, shame obstructs it, and above all, the fear of annihilation obstructs the process, because it's a deep letting go of our ordinary way of thinking and feeling and sensing ourselves in the world, all of which tend to be oriented strategically to stay in control and to maintain our image and the safety of our body, understandably. You know, we're oriented around safety. And so the invitation and the possibility of letting go is, in a certain way, in opposition to that tendency to remain contracted, vigilant, in control, and maintaining safety. And so this is why this descent of awareness is so important, because it needs to descend in order for it to really radiate out in our ordinary life and not just be, felt occasionally on retreat or on the zafu. Did that respond to your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess maybe just a follow-up question, and there's many themes that I want to come back to that you just touched upon, would be what within you kind of incited or inspired you to write this book now?
It's been a very organic unfolding. I actually didn't start writing the first anthology really until I was 50. And it wasn't until my mid-60s that the first book came. And so there's been a lot of, I think, personal gestation and maturity. And I didn't know if I had anything really to say that was important enough to write a book about. So I waited and waited and waited. And then things began to emerge. You know, the felt sense of inner knowing, that was the first book, In Touch. And then really opening up, so just to frame this kind of writing project as it's arisen. In my first book, In Touch, it's really about the sense of inner knowing and certain subtle somatic markers that accompany the felt sense and opening of authenticity. And one of them is an opening of space, another is an opening of the heart, another is a sense of alignment and grounding. And so the second book was really about the heart. And a lot of books have been written about the heart, but kind of the different levels, psychological and more subtle, soulful, and universal, hadn't been, in my experience, sufficiently articulated, particularly in terms of conditioning. And I had thought I would write a book about the heart and the ground because they're so intimately related. Like, for us to live from the heart, really, that is to say, not in a naive or romantic sense, but really from the depths of our being, and with this spontaneous quality of kindness and non-separateness. To really sustain that, we need a sense of profound safety. And that's where the ground comes in. So we can maybe share our heart with a few people, but that kind of deeper opening, generalized opening of the heart, actually requires that deepening and opening of the ground. So I thought maybe the two would go together as a book. And yet they came out as two. And it's been interesting because it hasn't felt like a personal project. It's more like, okay, this material has been deeply understood. It's of value to others when I share it in teaching. So it would be useful to write about. And so it just feels like it's kind of emerged out of my own experience personally in terms of this process of awareness dropping more and more deeply into the body, and then, you know, radiating out and being of benefit to others. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, this kind of process of feeling like the mind opening and the heart opening. Those happen more easily and quickly. The guts, this has been a much slower process, and I've had to navigate a lot more unconscious material instinct and fear, and it's taken more time. So anyway, and it's a kind of offering, you know, based on that. And as I wrote in the book at the end of my introduction, it feels like a final offering, really. I don't feel like I mean, I'll continue teaching as long as I can, but in terms of writing, I don't think there's anything else significant enough, you know, from my experience to share.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm appreciating that sense of inner knowing with which you've approached writing these books, and the word emerged, you know, as though that this material itself wanted to emerge through you. And
It feels that way. Yeah, it has that emergent quality. And when I was doing there's an audiobook version of this, Your Deepest Ground, and when I was down in a studio in Southern California a few months ago completing it, and just there was a very interesting, very quiet sense of inner completion. Like, you know, like there was something I needed to do and it's been done. And it wasn't an egoic pat on the back. It was much quieter than that. Like something, you know, some gift was shared and it was meant to be shared, and, you know, that's.
Wow, yeah, and that kind of subtle attunement, that kind of knowing, it sounds like has come from the work you've done to cultivate that inner felt sense. Is that right?
Very much so. Yeah, learning to listen, really, learning to get quiet, learning to distinguish the noise of our ordinary thinking mind from really a different way of knowing. And all of these books kind of are in support of that, kind of learning to listen in a deep way and making ourselves available to what's a very quiet, very intuitive, very deep intelligence that's available in all of us. And I think as we deepen into the heart and as the ground opens, the whole system gets quieter and deeper, and we open more and more to an essential life, to what feels like an upwelling, an essential life current that's not personal. And this is interesting. That there is it feels like a universal quality of life that moves through all of us and everything, and animates, you know, all of life, and yet it's not personal. It doesn't belong to anyone or refer to anyone, and yet it's profoundly intimate, and I can feel it as I speak about it. It's shared, and there's a sense of aliveness that comes with this. So in the emptying out, and so much of the opening of the ground is letting go of all the thoughts and feelings we have about who we are. And everything's dropping.
Yeah, the ground is falling out from underneath me.
Yeah.
Okay.
As there is that kind of emptying out process, which the mind is like emptiness. I don't want emptiness, you know, I want stimulation. But it's very interesting, as there is a recognition that this emptiness is actually quite fertile, pregnant, full of possibility, full of potentiality, full of life. Then there's a mature recognition that this deep letting go into, I would say, true nature, to use a Buddhist term. And I like this term, true nature, invites a very natural upwelling of life.
That's beautiful. Thank you. You know, I think as you're speaking, this theme of paradox, this sort of fertile, sacred paradox that feels like is at the heart of this term, your deepest ground in a way, right? Because I wonder if we could come back to that a little bit, because you know, as you mentioned earlier, when we think of ground, we usually think of something solid, right? Something firm, something that maybe will support us or hold us. And it seems like in this book, you're referring to your deepest ground as a sense of spaciousness, as you said, a sense of emptiness. And so, in what sense can we consider that a ground? And in what sense does that support and hold us in the way we might hope a ground, a solid ground, does?
Yeah, and this is the essence of paradox, right? Because various words have been used to point to this. Groundless ground, right? Okay, groundless ground, what does that mean? You know, or radiant void, you know, is another one. Empty fullness and so on. So in what sense can we think of this as the ground? Well, that's the other meaning of the word ground, I think, which is a sense of reality. And this is not a reality that could be, I would say, objectively verified, but it's subjectively recognized. In other words, as there's a letting go more and more deeply, a release process, as we see through illusion and there's a natural letting go and we find ourselves more and more empty, there's a sense of being more at ease. It can be disorienting if we're tightly contracted and we're letting go of that, no question about it. That's why there is resistance. But when there's a real relaxation that happens, there's a sense of a deep settling, like a deep, the words are so, you know, the language is so paradoxical. Good, it's a good conversation. It's like we land here. Here is so open. Like here is wide open. So it's not the little here of, you know, present sensory experience. It includes that, but not limited to that. That's sort of beginning mindfulness. You know, what am I thinking and feeling in the breath and so on. It's the capital H-E-R-E here. So there's a sense of ease and a sense of deeply being at rest. And that there's nothing else to attain or seek or change, and a profound sense that all is well, no matter what. And that it presents another apparent paradox, because, you know, the world's on fire, and democracy is under assault, and authoritarian, you know, leaders and governments are ascendant, and society is fragmenting and polarizing. And so how can you say all is well no matter what? And does that mean you're passive? No, it doesn't. It means there's a foundational sense of ease and well-being from which one can then act and respond in a much more creative way than would otherwise be available. There's a quality of clarity and love that's more available to move and meet circumstances as they are. So there's a sense, another way to speak about this is we feel seated in our inner authority. Like it's not like we claim a seat, but it's more that we find our seat, a seat that's always here, a seat of really quiet inner knowing, and a seat of inner authority that's not an authority over anyone. It's not about higher or lower. You know, it's not about domination or submission. It's just a deep resting in a quiet knowing of oneself. Not necessarily a knowing about what's going to happen or a technical knowing that, you know, that requires other kinds of investigation and effort, but a knowing of our being or of our essence. So it becomes impossible to describe in words, and that's why we use metaphor, and that's why we use paradox. And we understand that all of these metaphors and paradoxical phrases, groundless ground, radiant void, dynamic stillness, emptiness dancing, you know, you'll see this in many contemplative traditions among the most mature realizers. They find this kind of language to try to describe and point to something that cannot be contained by language. That's both empty and full, both dark and radiant, both silent and expressive as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like they operate as a koan in a way. I mean, it's something that the rational mind can't necessarily grasp, and that's a good thing, right?
That is a good thing.
Tours around it.
That's such an important phase, actually, as we know, and often accented in contemplative traditions, which is the limits of the rational mind. Rational mind's an incredible tool, a beautiful tool, important. Mental clarity and acuity is a wonderful thing, and it has its limits. And we get into terrible trouble individually and collectively, when we don't recognize that, when we think a purely rational and scientific approach is sufficient. I think, it's important, but it's not sufficient. It requires a deeper intelligence. And so when we recognize both the beauty and importance of the mind, but also its limitation, and it's like, oh, I don't know. I don't know who I really am. I have lots of ideas. I got lots of stories. I can roll out my narratives about, what I've done and where I come from and my various identities, all of which have relative truth, but none of which actually define us and therefore confine us. So there's a kind of natural humility that arises, like, I don't know. And this is not something that I can grasp. I can't know this. It's not that I'm ignorant, it's not that I'm a failure as a knower, but this is actually beyond the capacity of my analytic, ordinary thought, beautiful and powerful as it is. There is something greater, a greater mystery here that is alive in me, in you, in everyone, that I don't know, I can't know, and as I often say, I don't need to know. It's like, I don't need to know. That was a very important insight for me. It's like that kind of sort of releasing of the mind's agenda to control and opening in a very visceral and deep way to the mystery of life. And then we're open. And we're like available. And this is what koan practice hopes to engender, isn't it? It's like you baffle the mind and the mind chews on something and then it just collapses and, something opens, right? So same process, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the mind kind of collapses in exhaustion in a way. It kind of uses up its ordinary pathways of understanding. And I'm just appreciating the way you're describing not knowing as a state of openness. That's some way seems like the entryway into this inquiry is that state of openness. And in that openness, there's space for something else to come and meet
Exactly.
us. Right?
That's exactly it. So not knowing, this kind of not knowing is not ignorance, but it's a recognition of our limitation and a natural humility and an openness. And then the whole system begins to open, right? We get out of the tyranny of the shoulds, that is to say, how we think we should be experiencing. And we get very interested in what am I actually experiencing? That question of should tends to fall away, and it's like, what am I experiencing right now? And that can take us so deeply, if we follow that. And if we really want to follow that, this is another interesting aspect of this process is what I would call the love of truth. Not truth as a dogma or point of view or ideology, but the truth of our being or of our essence. There's something in us yearns to know that. It's more or less alive in different people. Sometimes we have to hit bottom, and really have a difficult experience of, our limited way of living before we crack open. And other times we're drawn by I just know there's more here to life. And I want to explore this. I really want to know, what am I really? And what is this? conventionally we call the world and society and others? Is it as I ordinarily think, or actually is there a subtler and deeper and truer way of living and perceiving?
Yes, yes. It reminds me of the Zen koan, not knowing is most intimate, it seems like, right? That not knowing allows us to be intimate with our experience as it is, with the world, right? And sort of breaking us out of the kind of encapsulated illusion of the separate self.
Exactly. Not knowing is most intimate. I love that. I've heard that before, and the intimacy with 10,000 things, which is prior to Dogen, but it comes from the Chan masters too. It means with everything. And I have to say, this is something that I was clueless about many years ago as a young meditator. I had mixed motives. I think one, I was interested in what I considered to be higher states of consciousness, but I also just wanted to be more relaxed socially, because I was kind of an anxious guy, and I wanted to be more at ease in connecting with other people, and that actually required some psychological work as well. But so there was a mixed motive. There was more egoic motive to be at ease, but I could looking back, I can see there was that thread of really following something that was in a way calling, and calls many of us on this path.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I might shift gears a little bit here and just maybe we could talk a little bit. We've talked about the deepest ground, and I'd love to kind of hear more about and maybe discuss more the felt and lived sense of the deepest ground. But you also talked about something called the false ground.
Yeah.
And the false ground is something that we need to see and feel through, right, in order to open to the deepest ground. Could you say a little more about the false ground? And
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really critically important principle in exploration. I would say the false ground, and this was something that this concept emerged. I'm sure others have named it and perhaps pointed to it because it's such a human experience, but it emerged very spontaneously in my work with people. What I began to see, and this was kind of surprising to me at first, was that we have our ordinary identity. We have a psychological image, a story we try to maintain of ourselves. That's part of our false ground. And then also developmentally, and quite naturally for everyone, we identify with this particular body-mind. And we say, this is me, I'm in here, this is mine, that's you, and you're over there, and you're different, which is true on a certain level. There's differentiation and individuation, and it's not the whole truth, right? Because it's something we share in common ground, common heart. So in this process of identifying with our psychological material and our individuation process, we construct a false ground. And it has a cognitive dimension in terms of our story, our narrative about ourselves, consciously and subconsciously, and even unconsciously, about who I think I am. There's an emotional aspect to it, our feelings, and there's a somatic aspect to it. And this I've given particular attention to. For whatever reason, I happen to be very sensitive energetically, and I can kind of feel when people clench, when they clench and where they clench, and we tend to clench along the midline, and also in the heart, in the gut, solar plexus, lower belly, base of the spine. It corresponds pretty well with the Indian subtle body tradition I found, but other subtle body traditions as well. So in our adaptation as individuals to life, after facing difficult situations and shocks, we tend to pull in and freeze. We know this is true in trauma. There is that freeze response, and we can even dissociate if it's too strong. But there's a kind of somatic contraction that happens as an individual. There are layers to this. Some are conscious, some are largely unconscious. And we identify with that. And the image that I use to talk about that is just of a closed fist. Like we take ourselves as as a contracted individual. And as we begin to discover that that's not the case, this begins to feel threatened. Like, well, I thought I was this. And if I'm not this, then I won't exist. So that's the false ground, because there's a conflation. There's a belief that if this releases, I won't exist. I'll die. Either my self-image will, be gone, and the self-image, won't exist. A little bit of truth to that. Certainly, we're not attached to our stories in the way we were before in our image. But we also conflate our image with our physicality. And we think if my image is lost, then my body will die. We don't cognitively make that connection, but kind of in a deep instinctual sense, we do. And so, so this is what I'm referring to as a false self. And it's not about, what's interesting, I have found in my work with people, it's enough to see the false as false. It's enough to see an illusion as illusion. It's enough to see what's untrue. And when that's seen with real clarity, there's a release that happens. It's like something pops, or sometimes it pops, sometimes it just melts. There's more of a, that kind of frozenness begins to thaw and melt. And I'm sure, you've probably experienced, I've experienced it, when there's an unwinding of some psychological material or the sense of being a separate self. I have found in terms of the false ground, it tends to localize along the midline, as I said, in the trunk, in the heart, in the guts, but most importantly at the base of the spine. And this is in the Indian subtle body tradition, the root chakra. And this is real. It's not just some, abstract system, and quite palpable, certainly for me and for others who have some sensitivity. It's a contraction in the pelvic bowl at the base of the spine. And it has to do with trying to survive. And so psychological elements that threaten it are early fears of abandonment, engulfment, attack. And this can go very deeply. If we've had that kind of, tumultuous or not only tumultuous, but disconnected experience growing up, that leaves a deep imprint in the psyche, and we play it out in the rest of our lives. And we know this as individuals and as therapists who work with individuals, that these imprints are very deep and powerful. So we act on the basis of that false ground. And as it unwinds, we discover what's there always, what is here. I speak of there as if it's somewhere else. It's nowhere else, it's here. It's always here. It's like, well, what's in the center of this? Space. This has been such an interesting discovery in my work with people. It's like, so they feel a knot of contraction. The invitation is, don't try to change it. Don't try to get rid of it. What if you just welcome it in to a sense of open, spacious awareness and notice what happens as you do? It's like, very often, not always, because there often can be a corresponding belief that keeps it, tightly held. Very often there's a natural kind of softening and opening and a discovery right in the center of that icy contraction. It's just openness. There's light. There's space. It's like, oh, this is what I am, not this. And that's what we could call true ground or groundless ground, that kind of spacious, open, living awareness that's in our very core, but veiled. So for me, it's an unveiling process, and generally, this is a bit of a sideline in terms of the conversation, it takes time for that to happen. We're so kind of acclimated to our false ground and identified with our false ground that it can be, if we're all to release suddenly, and occasionally that happens, it can be very expansive, joyful, but also very disorienting. And that can happen with, if you're using psychedelics too much, or maybe you have a premature Kundalini awakening, or you're you're monkeying around with energies and, not really grounded and don't have good guidance, those kinds of openings can happen. But in my experience, this release, the seeing and seeing through, feeling and feeling through, sensing and sensing through of our false ground is a gradual process, and there are layers to it. And it's a very intuitive process. Like sometimes something will need to be addressed in the mind in terms of a belief that we've inherited from childhood, that I'm not enough, or something's wrong with me. There goes the hand, right? So we have a limited sense of self, and we pull in and protect ourselves. Or maybe it's, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm unacceptable. This tends to be, these kind of worthiness and shame issues tend to localize more in the heart and the gut. And maybe it's, I'm unsafe, and the world is dangerous, and I need to, hide and disappear. And anyway, some attention will go to the heart, and some to the ground, and some to the mind, and then it's very interesting how attention will just like move in a very fluid, this, working with people in your own experience, in a very fluid way. And I trust this process. If there is enough safety and attunement, and this can be offered by a guide, a teacher, a coach, a therapist. The name isn't so important. What is important is the presence, the attuned presence. And when we feel ourselves received in that quality of loving attention and attunement, this provides an optimal environment and aspects that were missing often when we were growing up, and allows for that kind of gradual melting and movement of attention. So very often when I sit with people, we may just sit in silence and things will start moving, but maybe I'll start with a question: where is attention being called right now? And we begin to learn to trust that movement of attention.
Yeah, I think that what's striking me is that often we are operating from our false ground, and yet it's very unconscious, right? It's very habitual.
Largely.
Largely, right? We're so identified with it.
Individually and collectively, yes.
Individually and collectively, right? And so it seems like bringing, like that step of simply bringing awareness to these layers of conditioning and these layers of false ground is in and of itself transformative, and yet we need to approach it from a place of presence. Is that right? So
Very much
how
so.
we relate to it is so important, and who we delve into this journey with is also vital.
Yeah, how we do it ourselves and with whom we do it. And this has been very interesting because, I'm retired as a therapist, but for many years, and I've trained therapists when I was teaching here, it took me a while to understand the difference between approaching experience from the mind that like kind of wants to get somewhere and make something happen, and there's a kind of a therapeutic pressure when you're being paid and there's so much time and you want something to happen, versus really presence, which is different than ordinary mind, which I would call awake, spacious awareness. And this is why when I'm working with people, before we actually dive into something in terms of bringing attention to it, I'll invite them to rest back. It's like, just take a breath, let your attention drop down and in to your body. Wait a little bit so there's a sense of more here, more grounded. Rest back into a sense of open, spacious awareness. No effort, just relax back. No work to do, nothing to attain or achieve. Just for a minute. And then in that openness, now welcome your experience without an agenda to fix or change it. Because mind's subtle, it wants, of course I'll accept it if it leaves, if I can get rid of it, you know that, we all know that. But spacious open awareness or presence doesn't have that agenda. It just wants to get to know the experience more intimately. So this, we could call it the highest form of mindfulness, or just presence. is just welcoming experience. And for me, that creates an optimal environment for our experience to unfold. And it's like it's waiting to be met, that quality of awareness. And it has a quality of love. There's a tenderness there, a kindness, an affectionate curiosity that just naturally meets our experience and invites it to unfold in its own way and in its own time. Now, having said that, what I have noticed is the importance of cognition too. Like if there is a contraction in the heart and say at the base of the spine, and there's a welcoming of that, and it remains fairly static and not moving, I'll say, is there a belief that goes with that? Usually a very simple one that a child might say in a few words. Yeah. And it might be, I'm going to die. If I let go, or if I feel this, or if I know this, I'll die. And we'll check and see, does that say it? Is that really it? There'll be a charge when there is. And then the invitation is a little bit different than just resting back and welcoming. It's more an invitation, what is your deepest knowing about this belief? That you'll die now. That now you'll die. Don't think about it. What is your deepest knowing? What's the truth now? That now is important because these beliefs were formed early on. And these parts that are still compartmentalized live in these worlds as if it's still true, you know. And so this is a very important inquiry, part of this seeing and seeing through. It's like, what's true now? That's like, this is believed that it's unsafe and that you'll die, but what's your deepest knowing? Don't think about it. And this is where the light of awareness really starts to imbue the conditioned body-mind, and where transformation happens. And people will say, I don't know what it is, but I just kind of know it's not true. You know? And I'll say, let it in. Let this in. Let this knowing in. And this is where kind of spirituality and psychology kind of marry. You know, they've never been separate, actually, but where they stop being, divorced artificially. And there's a meeting, you know, of the conditioned body-mind with our unconditioned, open, true nature. And in that, there's a natural unfolding and unwinding that goes at its own pace, I found.
You know, I think that's so important what you're naming about being almost, I don't think the word meticulous is quite right, but really noticing the type of presence you're bringing to these conditioned, frozen experiences of the false ground, because one of the exercises in your book is about being with terror, right? And I found that very powerful and almost a kind of fierce path to sit with and be with terror. I think many therapists or you know, those in the healing profession, when someone's experiencing terror, they might be trained to, or kind of more comfortable inviting them to notice safety or resource. But you're really saying, no, actually, you know, maybe that's just engendering a kind of a false, you know, in some ways a false belief, right? But you're saying actually being with the terror.
If you're sufficiently resourced.
If you're resourced, yeah.
Otherwise it's re-traumatizing, isn't it?
Right.
So, but it's true. And I think this is the interesting thing. So our frame of understanding, whether we're being with our own experience or we're being with someone else's experience, is very important, right? It really has profound implications. And so if this territory of emptiness, of false ground, feels threatening to us as a helper in whatever role we're in, we are going to both consciously and unconsciously avoid it, and therefore support those we're helping to stay within their false self. And we may do more conventional resourcing to make the ego feel more at ease, the separate sense of self. But what's interesting is the terror itself is a portal. And this is what we begin to discover, like, okay, so if I feel safe enough and resourced enough that I can welcome it a little bit, right? Not that I have to go somewhere, do something, accomplish anything, but just receive it a little bit, notice what happens, and as it begins to thaw, unwind, and that can involve some shaking and crying sometimes if it needs to. It doesn't have to, but it does sometimes. It's a natural release process. And then it's like, oh my goodness, this which I have avoided my whole life, and my hands are gesturing down here, this which I have been drugging myself and distracting myself and for all my, is actually a kind of entryway to my depths. Our whole orientation changes. Right? We realize this is essential to pay attention to. That takes some maturity and some courage, but really understanding of that. And so if we're working with someone who does understand that, who has walked sufficiently, or fallen, I should say, rather than walked, like just dropped sufficiently or fallen open, then we'll feel trust that this is actually an authentic opening, that this apparent death is really a birth, really a birthing, that in letting go of what we thought we are, we're actually opening to something much more profound and true and authentic.
Yes, thank you. I think that I'm thinking about some of the clients I work with, and there's a theme among many of my clients of a black hole in the belly.
Yeah.
Right, the black hole in the belly. And I know you discussed in your book the difference between deficient emptiness and full emptiness.
This is a distinction Hamas makes.
Hamas, yeah, right.
Hamid Ali.
And in some of my work with my clients, although I think in this sense of the black hole in the belly, there was a sense of a kind of deficient emptiness or a way that the personal will or self did not get to develop in a healthy way. We've also been able to use it as a portal by kind of going up to the edge of that black hole and checking out what's really there. What's really at the edge of that? And it's sort of transformed into a cauldron. It's transformed into kind of other kind of magical portals, or like a great expanse of the starry Milky Way.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of empty. What happens is, and this has been quite interesting to see, is what we do is we project our, early childhood worldview onto reality. So if we've been abandoned, then reality is abandoning. If we've been attacked, reality is attacking. If we've been engulfed, reality is engulfing. And then to actually question that and discover something very different, that archaic projection is just that.
Yeah.
And there's like luminosity, the stars.
Right.
That's what I was struck by in that image. Like there's some luminosity in this darkness, and that it's not just a dark vortex that pulls us under an endless grieving or powerlessness. I mean, I'm thinking what might be true of a black hole in the heart or in the solar plexus, but it's actually a way through.
Right.
And this is just, I'll mention it as an aside, it's been very interesting, this theme of portals, because the heart is a fundamental portal to our being and to our love and our non-separation. And there are many layers to that. But as it opens, it feels like the backspace opens. It's like this love is coming through, from behind and from in front as well. And this is true here in the solar plexus, which tends to be the center of the personal will, which you were alluding to. And if it gets crushed early on, it needs actually to be developed. Set boundaries, say no, say what you want and don't want. But there's a deeper dimension to that as well. And where we feel what could be Asajoli called a transpersonal will, or a will that's non-personal. There's a movement of some power, creative power, but not power over, but a life-giving power as well. And so this area of the gut is very interesting, very, very lively, dynamic area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this theme of will and control is really interesting. That comes up a lot in your work, and that part of what we're releasing as we release the false ground is the illusion that we can, through will, create our own ground, or we can, through our will, control our reality so that we feel comfortable and safe, so that we don't have to experience suffering. And it seems like this clenching, this like embodied clenching that you describe, I've experienced it for many years in my jaw.
In the jaw,
right?
yes.
As though I'm literally trying to hold the world together with my mouth, right? That I'm trying to,
That's right.
right? And as though that density, as though we're trying to create more density in the body, and that will give us stability.
That will give safety.
Safety.
That's the contraction.
Right.
It's like if I can be tight enough, I'll be safe.
Right, right.
And we discover the opposite is true.
The opposite.
We discover the opposite is true.
Yeah.
Like that tightly controlled way of being creates tremendous suffering. It doesn't release us from suffering, and it doesn't make us any safer. So the issue of safety is so important. Our lives are organized around the issue of safety. And so it's like what you're pointing to is to question this theme of safety and what is safety and what creates safety.
Right, right. And the other side of that being trust, that we can really trust this groundless ground, even though it is groundless, even though we're carried along it, maybe like a river, more
Like a
so.
river.
Right, but we can trust it. I remember an experience on a meditation retreat where something in me really released, and I had this image. It was almost like in the scene in Cinderella where the little birds came and wove her dress for her, and kind of I felt as though there was just something being repaired and healed and attended to, and it was such a kind of heart-melting experience, because I thought, oh wow, there is something there that's holding and tending me, and it's dynamic, right? It's not static, but there's something I can trust, and so.
This is fundamental. I mean, it seems, earlier I was saying it's all about letting go. It's about letting go and trusting.
Yeah.
If I had to say, what is a spiritual, life about essentially? I'd say it's about trust, not faith. It's not about believing in something, but it's a visceral trust. And it doesn't mean bad things, so-called, won't happen, or that, we won't have difficulties, that we won't get sick, we won't be disabled, it doesn't mean any of that. It's much more fundamental in exactly the way that you're talking about, that there is something greater here that's holding us and guiding, this show and this expression that we can relax into, like a river.
Right.
And we ease into it again and again and again. And as we do, it takes us in unexpected directions. We meet unexpected people. Unexpected doors open, and we feel more and more intimate, really, with life. So we're kind of, it's like, it's a safety, we see through the illusion of relative safety. Yes, I mean, we do take care of our body, mind, we don't take unreasonable risks, and, we do take care of ourselves, but on that fundamental level, that contracted level of trying to keep it all together and trying to control what we can't in order to be safe, there is a release and there is an ease. And we do feel ourselves more and more trusting of the flow of life.
Yeah. And, I'm just struck by that. That's not something that we can will or that we can rush, that trust and that knowing. Like, we can know it theoretically, but to really know it is something that is a process of attuning, becoming more and more intimate with the fault, like with the layers of conditioning, bringing kind and compassionate attention to them, and that knowing gradually sinks through the body.
It does.
Yeah.
And it's a gradual process. It's a reorientation.
Yeah.
Often preceded by a disorientation. We have a certain comfort zone that's actually not so comfortable, right? And where we don't learn very much. And as we start letting go of that and learning more, it can be shaky. It can be disorienting, but it leads to a deeper orientation as well. It takes time, takes courage, takes a willingness. Much more than willfulness.
Yeah.
A willingness to be open and discover what's really true.
So we just have a couple of minutes left, and I'm just wondering in these last couple of minutes if there's anything that you want to offer around how can our CIS community integrate these teachings into their spiritual practice or into their meditation practice to make more space for the deepest ground, to kind of bring in this willingness rather than this willfulness. Like any practical tips that you would have, or if there's a different direction you want to go
Or
for the last
impractical
couple, or
tips. How about
impractical
impractical
tips.
tips?
Could be a koan, you know, whoever
Yeah,
wants to come
koan.
through.
No, I don't do koan work. Well, I would begin with curiosity. It's like become more curious about what's happening in the lower half of your body. Pay more attention. Like start to listen to the interior of your body, to the trunk of your body, and particularly the lower half. And it can help to imagine breathing. This is like a basic meditation, mindfulness meditation. It's like just sit and put your hands on your lower belly and breathe. It could be a formal meditation or informal. But it's more about, it's a way of anchoring attention lower. And one of the things I didn't talk about at all, and maybe I'll say a little bit here, which is about the nature. There's layers to the ground. Like there's this psychological material that unwinds itself and often has a quality of being underground and in a basement or a sub-basement. Sometimes it's interesting, as the personal conditioning clears, ancestral conditioning comes in, lineages. And I did want to mention that because that's part of the ground, and that's actually part of the reason I postponed writing the book, is because even though I was familiar with Jung's teachings to some extent, I wasn't trained in it, but loved his memoir and read a number of his books, and that resonated for me. I needed to go back before I wrote this book, and this is my inner guidance, and I write about this, in order to revisit this archetypal level, what Jung called the land of the dead, which corresponds very closely with ancestral conditioning. Not entirely the same, but really closely related. And he called the collective unconscious the land of the dead, unredeemed and unanswered. And this is very resonant for me now. And so part of this is, speaking of like the native people who've lived on this land, and our native people and ancestors. There's all of this is in the mix of the deep psyche, the human psyche. And in this process of opening to the ground and being curious and open, this material will sometimes emerge if it needs to. So it's important, part of it, be curious, educate yourself, like learn more about this. Be open in your exploration, be courageous too, because as we understand kind of the importance of this, it's important not just for our individual awakening and growth and transformation, this is important collectively, because this is like the opposite of self-indulgence. We're really looking at what we take to be the self and seeing through it, and that opens up dimensions that are collective in terms of human past experience, but just essential in terms of our relationship to life and one another and to society, and to how we're going to be moving collectively, in our economic systems, in our systems of governance, how we relate to the natural environment. Do we relate in a way of dominating and exploiting? Or do we relate that this too is my true nature and needs to be treasured, and needs to be not just respected, but really enhanced and supported as well. So there's many implications here, and I think we need, I think we're in a real crisis, collectively as human beings. Unprecedented. We've been in prior ones, but this one's, I think our trajectory is very shaky at this point. And so we need all hands on deck, and we need our contemplatives to be involved and share their wisdom, and activists to connect with their depths, and for all of us to understand that we each play an important part in this unfolding, and to do our best in support of that.
Thank you. I mean, I feel like you're really speaking to the underworld journey, the willingness to, as you said in your work, to make the descent and to meet the layers of the archetypal layers, the personal layers, the collective layers there, rather than bypassing, right? This is really an antidote.
And
to
rather than
spiritual
acting them
bypassing.
out again
Right.
and again and again in cycles of violence.
Right, which we're seeing in some ways. It seems like colonialism and modernity are kind of collective actions of the false ground, of a sense of needing to control, a sense
Yes.
that we can provide safety.
Domination, control, safety,
Control,
all that
right.
authoritarianism,
Right,
domination.
Exactly.
It's
Seeing
all out of
play.
that. It's the same theme.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So addressing it on collective levels and individual levels and weaving those as well.
Right.
So we all have something to contribute to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, John. I wish we could have another hour to talk about this topic.
Yeah, me too. It's rich, isn't it?
It's very rich, but I think we should move to audience questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay. Okay. So, the first question I see here is, how do you, a psychotherapist, reconcile the fragmented truths that trauma can create with a spiritual search for a deeper unified truth? And I think this is a great question. How do you help clients discern whether an impulse is true or trauma driven?
Mm. Well, what I've noticed is, maybe I'll speak to this in terms of different ways of knowing, and to the importance of the felt sense as well. What I've noticed about real discernment, real clarity, is it's how non-insistent it is. It doesn't assert itself. It doesn't argue. It doesn't rationalize. It doesn't explain. So it has that, what traditionally has been called the small, still voice within. And it's endlessly patient. So it doesn't have that insistent or judgmental quality to it. So that's one way I differentiate between that kind of inner knowing and the mind, which is, so actively commenting. And, when we've been traumatized and our system is activated and, our minds can be a little crazy, and have that quality of judging, insisting, pushing, denying. And so that's one way to differentiate. Another is the inner knowing, and here there's some subtleties. There's genuine emotion, but it doesn't have a reactive quality to it. And so, for instance, take grief. In my experience, as the system opens increasingly and we free ourselves, there's a kind of clarification and purification of the grieving process. In other words, it doesn't have the story, I've done something wrong or it shouldn't have happened. It's just like missing, the natural human connection. This person that I've loved and cared about is gone, and I miss them and I grieve that, for instance. So it's like the emotions are clarified, and so they have a kind of, they're simpler, and they go through more quickly as well. And other reactive ones, like say shame and so on, tend to diminish increasingly. We tend to, as there's more self-acceptance and self-love, that kind of, those old stories and feelings of unworthiness tend to diminish as well. So it's the difference between being deeply at ease and very highly activated, too, on a somatic level. There's just more and more calmness in the system, more quietude, I would say. And it's an alive quietness. It's not a numbness. And we feel ourselves, rather than dissociated and aversive, we feel ourselves present and open, welcoming, embracing. So those are some maybe distinctions to be made.
Thank you. Yes, the non-insistent quality that really sticks with me. I felt that invited a large breath. And I think one thing I want to add is that a way we can think of trauma is the system's attempt to cope with or defend against feelings that seem like they would be annihilating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can differentiate that from terror, being with the terror, or that sort of non-insistent voice, in that this non-insistent presence doesn't have those qualities of defense. It doesn't attempt to get away in the way that trauma does.
Mm-hmm.
So here is another question from the audience. How have your learnings as a psychotherapist challenged or reshaped your original spiritual or theoretical beliefs? Can you share a specific experience that marked a turning point for you?
Well, they've definitely had a big impact, because initially my first exposure to spiritual teachings was through Yogananda, Ramakrishna, the Indian Vedanta tradition. And then I began meditating when I was 20, over half a century ago, and was doing mantra, effortless mental repetition of mantra, tien, transcendental meditation. And I was kind of thinking this is what spirituality was about, that it was transcendental. It was about achieving some state of consciousness. And that if you just sat long enough and went to enough retreats, all your stuff would just, release. That wasn't true. So that's one reason I stopped being a TM teacher and left that organization. There are other reasons too. And why even though I did take a single class in psychology as an undergraduate, but why I'm a graduate of this school. When it was in 1978, I came, when it was California Institute of Asian Studies, and not very developed at that point, but knew that I needed to work, with my stuff, so to speak. And so that really, the whole question of what is the connection between spirituality, spiritual practice, spiritual life, and psychological healing work, between awakening and healing, was just like an open question, because I was following both tracks, training as a therapist, working as an intern, just working with psychological stuff, and meanwhile, doing this deep inquiry practice. And they felt like two different tracks for a while, and each was kind of influencing the other in interesting ways. I was reading Jung, and I was reading also the existentialists and transpersonal and Wilbur and John Wellwood and things like that. And then I was sitting with my teacher and going on long retreats, and he didn't have much interest in psychology, and started working with people. And then probably about 10 years into my private practice, I couldn't distinguish between the two tracks. It's like, now what's spiritual and what's not? I remember there was a moment I could no longer distinguish. Like my worldview had changed, and it's like it's all spiritual work, just different levels of it. And then I became very interested in this. So how does presence itself, how might this function? How does non-dual awareness possibly impact the therapeutic relationship? And at this point I was teaching here at CIIS and introducing the phenomenon of presence. And also, how does inquiry, like different levels of inquiry, affect the psychotherapeutic practice? And, the result is, we're two anthologies on non-dual wisdom and psychotherapy, and conferences in this room for a number of years, actually. For over 10 years, we held an annual conference on this subject. So this is how they've kind of woven together. And was there a particular moment? I don't think so. It's just, I think what was most important really is my self-honesty. It's like, I had to realize that my spiritual path was somewhat off the mark, you know, that I wasn't fully facing my experience. And I needed to be more honest with myself. And that involved being more relational and more in touch with what was getting in the way of that. And then there's just been a kind of deepening conversation and ultimate non-separation between those domains. I can say, you know, we can say false ground, true ground, we can say unconditioned, conditioned. There are differentiations to make, but ultimately it's like all the same thing as far as I can tell.
Thank you. All right. And the next question is, in your experience, have you found any particular therapeutic modalities beyond safety and attunement particularly supportive in helping clients access their deepest ground?
Accessing their deepest
ground.
A particular therapeutic modality?
Yes.
That does. I really, I think some are kind of closer, more helpful, more comprehensive, and I've probably stolen and borrowed from a number of systems, you know, that accent more experience, direct experience, and but it's hard to name one in particular. For me, it's been a blend, actually, and rather eclectic, and I kind of learn from different. I mean, the truth is, most of what I learned, I didn't learn in class. You know, I really learned from taking workshops and going on meditation and reading books and listening to different people, and I think it was a matter of resonance. It's like, did something really ring true for me or not? And then I began to weave in these various influences. And I think if we're really a mature practitioner, this will happen. You know, we may train in a particular modality. Maybe we train in an analytic approach or Hakomi or, you know, whatever, you know, even a, psychoanalytic approach or Gestalt or whatever. But at some point, we really become we find our own synthesis, you know, and then we make it our own. You know, then it's a lived exploration. You know, we're not imposing a framework in the meeting. We're in discovery. We're in conversation. And something very alive unfolds from that. So I'm being a little evasive.
Oh, I appreciate that. That's how I hold it as well, and I think you're speaking to that element of trust.
Yeah,
well there, right?
Exactly. Yeah, there's a way we can cling to a system, you know, and say this is it, you know, and yet I have found no system complete, and I don't think that's a problem, and I don't think my way of thinking is complete either. You know, it's like there's certain elements that have come through that have clarified and are of value to others, and they don't work for everyone, and surely there's even a better way to approach. That's my approach. It's like we're just open and learning.
Yeah, thank
always.
you. It reminds me of the quote that was in your book where Jung said, "Thank God I'm not a Jungian."
He said that several times, apparently.
Yes.
This was in the 50s, you know,
Yeah.
when the Jung Institute was really up and going, and he felt more and more alienated from the presentations, and they were getting formalized, and he said, "Thank God I'm not a Jungian."
All right, the next question is, earlier you mentioned a somatic knowing. Are there specific embodied practices that help you deepen your capacity to respond from this space of aliveness? For example, work with the land, movement, creative expression that helps us bypass or at least soften the rational mind.
All those are great, and I've done all of them, Again, it's like specific practices, the ones that appeal to you, the ones that are resonant for you, the ones that touch you, the ones, so for some of us, it's like being out in nature. I'm a backpacker. I love to get out in the wilderness and just spend days, just hanging out with in the high Sierras, and maybe it's, you know, a somatic practice of some sort. Maybe it's a sitting practice. I mean, in my case, I seem to be wired in this kind of, with this sort of sensitivity. I know I had some of it as a boy with no practice, but I also know that sitting for long periods seemed to cultivate it because there was a quietude and a attunement inwardly. So I did find that long meditation retreats enhance this. I found that being open to intimate contact, right, in personal relationships, and, you know, I'm not talking about sexual intimacy, I'm talking about emotional intimacy, you know, being really listening and attuning with another person, whether it was therapeutic or relational, really enhanced this kind of inner sensitivity, and being willing to be wrong, you know, being willing to say, is this happening? Is that not? Oh, that must be my stuff. And if it's my stuff, to look at it. And that's still going on, you know, it's not a perfect process, but all of these have been supportive modalities for me. And I'm, you know, dance can be, and martial arts, and but it all comes down to a quality of listening, a recognition, this is important to pay attention to, and then a willingness to actually attend tenderly and over time. And it's like tending the blossom of a flower. That quality of attention, it's like sunlight to a bud, you know, and there's a response, you know, that warmth, that curiosity, that attention, that affection to the interiority, our deep interiority. It wants that, it needs that. If we have it as children, if we're lucky enough to have a parent or parents who could really listen and attend and attune in a loving and open way, non-invasive way, we blossom. We just know that. And so, and the blossoming is always from the inside out. You know, it's like there's something intrinsic in us waiting to flower and waiting to open when it feels safe, and when we feel there's a quality of attention that invites that. That's in the depths of all of us. And so whatever supports that, you know, it can come from many different dimensions, will be different for each of us because we're so individuated. But when we feel the truth of that, to really trust that and give our attention to that.
I'm just feeling from your transmission right now how important it is to have another model that, to have another do that for us when we might not have the experience or the early modeling of that type of attention, because then we can internalize it and turn it towards ourselves.
We're very relational beings, and we need that quality of attention, and most of us don't get it, or we get it only partially or conditionally, and we thrive when it's offered to us, and it's deeply gratifying to offer it to another. You know, much like a gardener with a flower. You know, you want to see life blossom. You know, you want life to have the same experience there as here. You know, in this unfolding. So it's not enough, in my experience, it's not enough just to sit in meditation. And a guide can be really helpful on whatever level we're speaking. You know, whether it's a therapeutic guide or a coach who's attuned, or a spiritual teacher who can hear us and see us and meet us where we are in our own vulnerability and openness and honesty, and support the natural unfolding. And then at some point that becomes nice but not necessary. You know, but I do feel my experiences, my own guides have been very important models in terms of integrity and honesty and attunement. And I just naturally resonated with them, and you know, and I understand the importance of those qualities to offer to others.
Thank you. One final question, and that is, what role does imagination play in accessing the spaciousness of the deepest ground?
Here I would maybe make a distinction between I haven't thought about this carefully, between kind of conditioned imagination and unconditioned imagination, which might be the difference, for instance, between dreams that are very, come from sort of a more egoic and conditioned level, and dreams that come from somewhere else, from the depths of our being.
The big dreams.
The big dreams.
Yeah.
The big dreams. And so in a similar way, in the psyche, we can imagine all sorts of things. We could imagine this would be a horrible experience being together. It's not. It's a lovely experience, in fact. So that's, negative imagination, or it could be a fantastic experience, and then we're disappointed that it's not what we thought it was. But there are elements of the psyche that are very creative, that are very attuned. And poetry, for instance, that, is, we can say, imaginal, and certain kinds of poetry in particular feel like they just speak so deeply to the soul or the depths of our being. And either writing that poetry or hearing that poetry can be deeply catalytic as well. The creative arts come out of imagination, don't they? A great artist, in their silence or in their process, something new emerges and is profound and revelatory, individually and collectively. The creation of beauty and the contemplation of beauty that has come from an inspired artist, whether it's music or painting or sculpture or whatever form, can be deeply nourishing and resonant. So depends what we mean and from where that imagination comes from. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful. Well, I think that is the end of our questions and the end of our time together. I'm just so grateful for this conversation. Your work has inspired me personally. I use it in my spiritual counseling courses, and so I hope some of my students are watching this as well. It's just really such a privilege to get to converse with you and receive your transmissions directly. So thank you so much.
Transmission received. Likewise.
Yes, wonderful.
Given and received. Very much appreciated, Sarah. Yeah, lovely to be with you and to be with everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you for coming
Thanks
in
for
person.
coming
Yeah.
and listening.